Thank you so much for being here this morning. My name is Michael. I'm the lead pastor here. I hope you felt welcome the minute you got here if it's your first time. And this morning, as you can see, we are continuing our series through the Gospel of Matthew by looking at the second of two miracles that Matthew puts back to back in his Gospel. Again, these miracles, the purpose of these is not for us to stand with our jaws dropped. The purpose of these miracles is to highlight the greatness of Jesus Christ. And this text in particular is interesting. As I read it, a lot of you have probably heard this before. You may have even heard this passage preached. And a lot of times when this passage is preached, it highlights Peter as kind of the hero of the story, as the one that jumped out of the boat. But I don't think that's what Matthew's intention was. Matthew's intention, not just here in chapter 14, but all throughout his gospel, is to show us the greatness of Jesus Christ. One of my favorite things to watch on TV is whenever huge storms hit our country. I'm not like a fan of storms hitting our country, but it's fun to watch on TV. The fall is the best because the fall is hurricane season. For whatever reason, if a huge hurricane is about to hit the United States, I am like glued to my TV because hurricanes are interesting. What's interesting about a hurricane is just simply its unpredictability. They gain all kinds of steam in the water, and you have no idea what kind of steam they'll have when they hit land. And then it's a crapshoot to try to figure out where exactly the hurricane is going to go. But the best thing about watching the Weather Channel in the midst of a hurricane are the live reports on the shore. When the wind picks up to like Category 2 wind or higher, the reporters on the news are the best people to watch. Zero idea how any of them got stuck with like that job where, hey, you go stand on the beach, how they didn't get the desk job, but here they are. Gusts will pick up mid-news report, and then you have things like this happening. So this is NBC reporter in 2018, oddly enough, Hurricane Michael. So Hurricane Michael was one of the strongest hurricanes that ever hit the United States. When it hit landfall, it had sustained winds of 155 miles per hour. The YouTube clip is better because you can see that guy that looks like Bigfoot on the right kind of come grab him. But here's what happens. The end result is the reporter on the left is literally blowing away with the wind. The guy on the right grabs him, and then they both just kind of grab themselves and attach themselves to that massive cement post. I want you to keep this image in mind as I preach this morning. The main point of this passage isn't Peter stepping out of the boat. The big idea of our 12 verses this morning is that while we are the ones who get tossed around, Christ is the one who's the definition of stability. So you can almost look at that image as a picture of us in our lives. We're the news reporters out in 155 mile per hour winds, and Christ is the cement post. So I know that's a really lame example, but just roll with it. We get tossed around. Christ is the definition of stability. So hopefully by now you have your Bibles open to Matthew 14. Let's just dive right in, pick up the narrative in verse 22. Matthew tells us immediately, he is Jesus. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. So if you missed us last week, it's okay. Jesus has just gone from like the north side of the Sea of Galilee to the south side of the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus' intention was, I'm going to go to the other side of the lake and I'm going to rest. When he gets to the other side of the lake, he's not met by rest. He's met by thousands of people who walked alongside the Sea of Galilee to meet him there. And what do we see Jesus do? Jesus sees them. He sees them hurting, and he heals all of them. And then just a super fast version of last week's sermon, they have no food. It's dinner time. The disciples don't know what to do. There's a boy there, has 5 loaves of bread, 2 fish. Jesus takes it. He multiplies it. Everybody that's there eats to the point that their bellies were full. There were 12 baskets of leftovers. Jesus is not only shown as a healer, he's also a chef. So just good things happening. Now in verse 22, we pick up with a word that Matthew loves to use, immediately. Meaning like right after that event. Right after Jesus feeds the 5,000, Jesus tells his 12 disciples, hey, why don't you guys get back in the boat? Why don't you start rowing back to the other side of the sea? And then he tells the crowds, the 12,000 or so people that were there that just got fed a nice dinner, you're dismissed. He tells them where to go. So you see just in verse 22, you see the stability of Jesus Christ. He's directing people where to go, and where Jesus tells people to go is where they go. So where does everyone go? Verse 23, after dismissing the crowds, Jesus went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Well into the night, he was there alone. Meanwhile, the boat was already some distance from land, battered by the waves because the wind was against them. So right away, you see like this juxtaposition between Jesus and his disciples, right? Jesus dismisses the crowds. He tells the disciples to get in a boat. He's finally alone, and then we see Jesus go up on top of a mountain by himself to pray. Other than the time when Jesus was tempted by Satan in the wilderness, this is the only time in the Gospel of Matthew that we see Jesus by himself praying to God the Father. Remember, Jesus wanted rest. His original intention to go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee was to get rest, but the crowds followed him. Now, Jesus has done the miracle of healing. He's done the miracle of multiplying food, and now he's finally in a spot where he can get what he was looking for. And what he was looking for is to be filled with the presence of his Father. Meanwhile, where's the disciples? Where did Jesus dismiss them? Matthew tells us they're already some distance from the land, meaning that they weren't on the beach, okay? They're somewhere pretty far offshore. And we see in these verses that they're being battered by the waves due to heavy winds. Remember, I put an image up last week of the Sea of Galilee, how the Sea of Galilee is like a bowl and there's mountains all around it. So any massive storm would kind of hit off the mountains and make the sea extremely dangerous to travel. And here we see it's the wind that's battering the boat that the disciples are trying to row. John, with the same story in his gospel, tells us that at this point, they had only gone about 3 to 4 miles. So the Sea of Galilee, the entire width of the Sea of Galilee is 6 miles. So they're about halfway in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. I want us to put ourselves in the shoes of the disciples and just think of how exhausted they could have been. Meanwhile, what's Jesus doing? While his disciples are fighting a storm in a boat, he's just up on this mountain praying. Matthew tells us, how long has he been praying? Well into the night. Remember the big idea of this sermon. While we're the ones who are tossed around, Christ is the definition of stability. In these verses, we see that the disciples are the ones that are tossed around, but yet you see Christ as being stable. Remember, Jesus Christ is God. Jesus Christ is 100% man, 100% God. So all the attributes of God the Father are also in Jesus. So Jesus is what's called omniscient, meaning he knows everything. So while Jesus is up on that mountain, he knew what was going on with his disciples in the middle of the lake, yet you don't see any panic from Jesus. You don't see any expediency to get off that mountain or a rush for him to go rescue them. Here they are in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, riding the struggle bus or the struggle boat, probably filled with all kinds of anxiety, yet here's Christ just kind of chilling on a mountain by himself. That's calmness. And it's juxtaposed with unrest. Verse 25, Jesus finally makes his move. Jesus came toward them, walking on the sea very early in the morning. So how early, you ask? For those of you that are still sticking with the English Standard Version, that's a better version that translates this from Greek to English. It tells us that Jesus came toward them walking on the sea during the 4th watch of the night. So the 4th watch of the night was anywhere between 3 and 6 a.m. So you just think timeline here. If Jesus dismisses the dinner, dismisses the crowds after sundown, Jesus has probably been praying on top of that mountain for about 9 hours. 9 hours of communion with the Father, prayer, right? A lot of us struggle for like 5 minutes, but Jesus is up there for 9 hours. For the disciples, it was like 9 hours of rowing, and they only went 3 miles. Because of the wind, I'm not a mathematician, but they rowed about 1/3 of a mile per hour, okay? I can bear crawl that. Can you imagine the struggle it was for the disciples in the boat? 4 of the disciples were fishermen. They had all kinds of experience with the Sea of Galilee, but I promise you that all of them were exhausted in the boat, yet there's Jesus just as cool as a cucumber on top of the mountain by himself. What does this show us? It shows us that a lot of times many of us get caught in situations that feel a lot like what the disciples are going through. Not many of us row boats, but you get my drift. We go through struggles. There's a lot of days where you wake up and things kind of feel like a little bit of a slog. It feels like, man, my life in the past couple weeks or months, I've just steady been swimming upstream. And it feels like that for sometimes you're just doing it forever. Your prayers start to turn into, how long, O Lord, will you make me go through this season? But notice that in the midst of rocky seasons or wavy seasons, that Jesus isn't stressed. While the disciples were tossed around, Christ remained stable. He could have walked to the disciples on the first watch. Jesus knows when the wind is coming because he controls the wind. He could have walked to them in the sea on the first wind gust that came up, but he didn't. The disciples are shown in the middle of the lake struggling a little bit, yet Christ never shook. So what do we see? After a while, Jesus comes to them. They're struggling, yet Jesus is on the mountain praying for them. You're struggling, and Christ can see you today in your struggle. He knows exactly what you're battling this morning. He knows your frustrations. He knows your fears. He knows your anxieties, yet Christ calmly sits where? Romans 8:34, the Apostle Paul tells us that Jesus Christ, the one who's died and the one who is raised, is also right now sitting at the right hand of God, interceding for us. Well, who's us? His children. That as Christ stands and as you sit in your seat right now, Christ is in heaven interceding and praying on your behalf, just like he was on the mountain when his disciples are in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. If you're a Christian in this room, understand the implications of that this morning. Your timing isn't better than Jesus' timing. He knows the timing that's best for you, and he's also the one who will rescue you from your troubles in the timing that is right. The disciples are tossed around, yet Christ is stable. We get tossed around, yet Christ is stable. So now it's 3 a.m. The disciples are trying to row their boat to the other side, and they look off in the distance, and what do they see? They see a man walking on the water. Verse 26 says, when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. At this point, I'm assuming even though that there were some experienced fishermen on the boat who had seen some storms before, they had never looked out on the edge of their boat and ever seen some dude just kind of waltzing on the water, right? Of course, they have no idea what's going on. Matthew tells us that they're terrified. Literally, that word in the Greek means they were scared to death, like about to have a heart attack. The waves are one thing. Now we have a guy walking on the water. What's going on here? So they cry out, it's a ghost. It was common thought for people of that day that they believed in ghosts, so don't think that's weird. But right away, Jesus responds. Matthew uses that same word. It says, immediately Jesus spoke to them, have courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Immediately. Jesus saw their fear and he immediately responded. Jesus saw their fear and he did not delay. Before he even tells them who he is, he tells them, do not fear, have courage. While we are tossed around, Christ is the one who is stable. Here, while the disciples are filled with fear, Christ is the one who brings them calm. It is I, do not be afraid. Makes us remember when Jesus says, my sheep hear my voice, right? Jesus doesn't introduce himself. He says, it is I. That's common language of that day. Like if you're knocking on a door, that's what you would have said. He says, it is I. Do not be afraid. It kind of begs the question, doesn't it? When we're filled with fear, when we go through those seasons of our lives, is it calm? Is it Jesus that brings the calming presence into your life? I think the way that you answer that question honestly is dependent on how you see Christ working in your life. If God is our shepherd and we are his sheep, what are the implications of that? I was reminded this week of just the most popular psalm, arguably Psalm 23. What does it say? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of shadow of death, you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. If God is the shepherd and we're the sheep, then shouldn't our fear always be met with the utter calm of the one who holds us tightly in his grasp? Just as Jesus placed the disciples in the middle of a stormy sea, this morning he placed you in whatever circumstance that you're currently in, and he placed you there on purpose. Why? Because Jesus loves you. And what should our response be? Your waters might be choppy, but the response should be, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. So if you're going through fear, is Christ truly the calm? Now we have everybody's favorite part of the story. Our boy Peter just shouts out, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." This is really weird when you read it. Was there any way that Jesus could have given him affirmation it was him? Jesus, what's our code word? Jesus, what's my middle name? What's my mom's maiden name? What was my high school mascot? Anything. But Jesus, if that's you, just tell me to jump in the choppy waters, hop out of the boat, I'll come to you on the water. And Jesus doesn't mess around. Jesus right away yells back at Peter, "Come." And then Matthew tells us, climbing out of the boat, Peter started walking on the water, and he came toward Jesus. And I know a lot of us have heard this story a million times, but just think about it. They're not on the calm Lake Pleasant on a nice summer day. They're in the middle of a stormy sea. This boat has at least 12 people in it. So it's not like it was this little boat. A lot of commentators think that Peter, when he steps on the edge and jumps in the sea, it was like a 5 or 6 foot drop in the middle of a storm that had them rowing at a pace of 0.33 miles per hour. I mean, what's going on here for Peter to be crazy enough to hey man, I might as well try. If you're new to church and you've never heard this before, you're probably thinking wow, what a guy Peter is. Not only does he have the faith to jump out of the boat, he's walking on the water just like Jesus. Well, what happens next? Glad you asked. It doesn't end great. Verse 30. But when he saw the strength of the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." So what appeared to be extraordinary faith all of a sudden got crippled with doubt because of the surrounding circumstances. It was Christ who was in front of him, yet it was the wind next to him that distracted him. So he starts to lose his footing, he starts sinking, and then it's, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, Lord, can you save me?" And what does Jesus do? That word again. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand, caught hold of him, and said to him, "You have little faith, why did you doubt?" What do we see here? We see that even though Peter sinks, it's Christ that's stable. Notice that Christ is the first thing Jesus does is he catches Peter, then he teaches Peter. So look through this through the lens of our own doubt this morning, right? If Peter doubted and got thrown off by the circumstances around him, I can just say as your pastor, there's times where I doubt and I get thrown off by the circumstances around me. I'm guessing you're the same as me and Peter, right? That there's times in life where we get thrown off our mark, we get thrown off our rhythm, and doubt starts to creep into our lives. But what does Christ say to Peter? He says, "Oh, you of little faith." He doesn't say, "Oh, you of no faith." He says, "Oh, you of little faith." Peter had to have a little bit of faith just to get out of the boat to begin with. It's like the little bit of faith that Jesus needs to work with, right? Kind of like last week. It was just a little bit of fish and a little bit of bread that Jesus could multiply and do a miracle with. Your doubt, when you separate your doubt from Christ, it brings peril in your life. But your doubt, when it's attached to Christ, brings safety. Here we see that Peter is the one who's sinking, yet Christ is the only thing around him that's stable. Again, this story isn't about Peter. This is a story about Jesus Christ. And in the middle of this story, we see Jesus as solid as an oak tree in the middle of a tornado, as solid as a cement post in the middle of a Category 4 hurricane. Jesus reaches out his hand and he catches hold of his disciple. Read those words. What was Jesus like? We don't know how big Jesus was. Is he 6'1", 190, just average sized dude? That boat probably weighed 5 times as much as Jesus did. And here you see a picture of this boat that just can't stay stable. The boat that's just tossing all around with 12 guys in it. The disciples bumping their heads up and down, probably getting seasickness. Yet there's Jesus in the middle of the same exact sea, the symbol of stability. As solid and as stable as anyone could ever be. And he reaches out his hand and he catches hold of Peter. And now there's Peter clutched in the arms of Jesus Christ. And what happens? He's no longer sinking. He's being led through those same choppy waters, hand in hand with the Savior of the universe, the only one who's stable enough to carry him through the rockiness. So maybe you're in this room and you consider yourself a Christian, but you kind of consider yourself, you can relate to Peter this morning. It's like you have just enough faith to get out of the boat, but you get easily distracted by everything around you and doubt starts to creep in. Realize that when doubt starts to creep into Peter, he is not far from Jesus. He was close enough that immediately when he started sinking, Jesus was within arm's reach of him to grab out and get him. A lot of times when you're filled with doubt, you can feel like you're on an island all by yourself. I just want to tell you, doubt is a fairly normal thing to experience as a Christian. But here's the thing about doubts. Whether you go through doubt, Christ is always within arm's reach of you. You might be doubting and have water in your eyes. You're kind of treading water. But listen, Peter was caught by Christ, and then he's taught by Christ. Jesus didn't stand in the water and look at Peter like, you moron, swim. He doesn't do that to us. He makes sure that Peter is safe. And then as he pulls him in, he teaches him a lesson. He says, oh, you of little faith. Peter, didn't you just see me work a miracle 3 miles ago? Peter, haven't you watched as I've done all these things in all these other chapters? It's the same thing for us, isn't it? In moments of doubt, we tend to forget and be blind to the past faithfulness that Christ has brought you through. We have zero reason to ever doubt the goodness of God, yet our flesh starts to creep in and we do it anyway. If you're doubting this morning, I want to tell you that cement post isn't far from you. You just have to clear your eyes and see it. Christ remains strong even through your doubts. So now Peter and Jesus have their moment out in the middle of a choppy sea, and they're back in the boat, and look what happens. When they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those in the boat worshiped him and said, truly you are the Son of God. I always wonder why Jesus didn't just make the wind stop like when he picked Peter up, right? But whatever. They get to the boat. Think of Peter. He's all like sopping wet. The disciples are probably like, if you've been with us for a little while, we've been in Matthew for a little while. This should remind you of Matthew chapter 8. If you recall in Matthew 8, there's a story of Jesus and the disciples in the same exact boat on the same exact lake, and a massive storm happens. The disciples are trying to row the boat, and they're scared to death, thinking they're going to die because of the storm. And what do? They go to the bow of the ship where Jesus is sleeping. They wake Jesus up, and they beg Jesus, hey, can you come on the deck and just do something? Work your magic, Jesus. Let the sea be still. So Jesus comes to the platform of the boat. He commands the wind and the waves to stop. And then do you remember the response of the disciples in chapter 8 when Jesus does this? Matthew tells us that they were amazed and they asked, what kind of man is this that even the sea and the winds obey him? 6 chapters ago, the question was, what kind of man is this? Now the response is different. Peter gets back in the boat, Jesus calms the storm, and now the response is, truly you are the Son of God. The difference between their statements in chapter 8 versus here in chapter 14 is a progression of what Peter did. Peter had enough faith to get out of the boat and walk a couple steps, yet he didn't have enough faith to stay up. Yet it did not ever matter to Jesus. Peter had enough faith that Jesus could work with. Even if Peter was 20% faith, 80% doubt, that 20% faith was enough for Jesus. The disciples in chapter 8, they had doubt. They were asking questions like, what kind of man is this? Now you see that doubt has turned into full-fledged faith with here in verse 33, a confession, truly you are the Son of God. You see that progression in the 6 chapters, right? A progression of discipleship, which is why Matthew was written. Matthew's written to us by a disciple to tell us what it looks like for us to be disciples. And a lot of times our discipleship with Christ starts with doubt, but the closer you grow to Christ, those doubts start to dissipate. Soon you live a life that's rooted in the faith and the understanding that you remain in the hands of the one that controls the storm. That process is called sanctification. As Jesus gets back into the boat, we see the final mark of his stability. That storm only stops because Jesus Christ is the Son of God. There he is in the boat. He's the only person that's ever walked the earth. He's the only person that will ever walk the earth who can look at nature and tell nature what to do because Christ was there when nature was created. So some of you this morning, maybe you're a chapter 8 disciple. You hear this sermon and you're kind of thinking, what kind of man is this? Maybe you're new to church. You don't have much experience with Christ. I want you to see this morning that Christ is the only one that you can fully trust because he's the only one who's both fully good and he's also fully the mark of stability to where it should be the only thing that you anchor and attach your life to. If you came in this morning and you can relate to this, you kind of feel a little bit tossed around by life, let me tell you that Christ is the only thing that will bring you true peace and true calm. So to close, I just want to leave you with this takeaway. Whatever aspect of your current life models the instability of this story, the only way to make the unstable stable is to root the unstable to Christ. Maybe you walk in here, you feel tossed around, Christian or non-Christian. You've been rowing a boat, what seems like into a headwind for a really, really long time. Maybe you sit there in your seat this morning, you're kind of stuck in indecision, or maybe your boat is kind of being pushed all around. You just wish you had like a direction, but you know the direction it's headed in right now just doesn't feel right. I want you to know first off that if you feel like that, Christ is the one who sits right now praying for you on the mountain. Do you ever just kind of sit and wonder how much Christ cares for us? I want to encourage you this morning, stop rowing that boat all by yourself. Stop trying to fight all those waves by yourself. Pray for wisdom, pray for direction, pray for discernment, pray for help. Those things only come from the power of Christ. Maybe you're in here this morning and you're struck by fear. That's what kind of strikes you about this story. Maybe you're currently going through a health scare, or somebody close to you is going through something. Maybe you have fear of just the circumstances in our world right now, or what's going on around you. I talked to a couple in the lobby that had immense fear about their current financial situation. Fear of whatever in your life, fear of what your future looks like. I want to encourage you to anchor that fear to the rootedness of Christ. Know that He's the one who stands beside you, and He says, "It is I. I stand next to you, and I'm the one who's the good shepherd. I'm the one who stands next to you, and I can lead you beside quiet waters. I'm the one who stands next to you as you walk through the valley of the shadow of death." Lastly, maybe you're in here this morning and you're just flat out drowning. Your faith is dwindling. You're walking through a season right now of spiritual dryness to the point where you're about to just reach out and just tap out. Like, I don't want anything to do with this anymore. If that's you this morning, I want you to understand that you don't need to reach out. Christ is the one that reaches out and brings you in. He's going to catch you, and then He'll teach you. He's going to catch you, and then He'll tell you what's going on. He's going to bring you in and let you see, I've never gone anywhere in your life. And then He's going to ask you, "Oh, you of little faith, would you just trust me?" And know that you can trust Christ, because He's not just stable. It's because fundamentally Jesus Christ is good. So if you walked in here this morning and any aspect of your life is feeling a little bit unstable, I'm asking you this morning to leave here and root that thing to Christ. What does Christ want out of that situation? Because Christ is the definition of stability. Let me pray. Father, I thank you for just the goodness of who you are. God, I thank you for this story of just a miracle that your Son performed. But God, you see just His loving kindness toward those who are His. God, I thank you that for all the waviness of this life and all these things that we can run to, that we hope stabilizes us, God, that you are the true mark of stability. Lord, you are the thing that we can attach ourselves to that will never go anywhere. It will never let us down. It will never push us away. God, I thank you for that picture in this story of Christ just in the middle of the sea while everything around Him is all over the place, yet He stands still and in rootedness. Father, I pray for people in this room who are just going through struggles right now. They walk in here and they're carrying burdens or pain or whatever, Lord, the things that this life throws at us. God, I just ask that you give us the boldness to give those things to you and just anchor our life in you. Father, I pray for the people in this room who don't know you, the people who've never confessed you as Lord. They don't follow you, and they're just looking for stability. God, I pray that you open hearts, minds, and ears for your Spirit to save this morning. God, I pray as a church, you continue to just push us more toward faith in you, that jumping out on that water is something we don't even think twice about. God, that we know that it doesn't matter. We could take risks because we sit in the hands of your goodness. So God, I just pray that you stretch us. Lord, do the sanctifying work that only you can in this place with our people, God. But push our church, both individually as people and collectively as a body of believers, more toward faith in you this morning. So God, I give our time together to you and just ask that we leave here transformed by the power of your word. It's in your Son's name I pray. Amen.